Shining a light on the biological origins of PTSD. Shining a light on the biological origins of PTSD. You're listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Alibokas Alexander on Spreaker. Social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. This edition's reading focus comes to us from neurosciencenews.com and is titled Shining a Light on the Biological Origins of PTSD. It was published on February 2nd, 2023. That's today, the date of the reading, under the categories of neuroscience and psychology. Summary. Study reveals heightened activity in the amygdala in response to seeing surprised or neutral facial expressions could be a biomarker for the risk of developing PTSD following trauma. Summary. Study reveals heightened activity in the amygdala in response to seeing surprised or neutral facial expressions could be a biomarker for the risk of developing PTSD following trauma. Source: Tufts University. Understanding one's susceptibility to developing post-traumatic stress disorder is important. If you knew you were at risk, for example, you might steer clear of jobs that carry more likelihood of high stress and potential trauma, or seek treatment as soon as you experienced a potentially triggering event. Now, a research team has found a marker that indicates vulnerability to the disorder. They discovered that heightened activation in one particular brain region in response to seeing surprised and neutral facial expressions appears to be tied to developing PTSD. A number of symptoms define PTSD, but the researchers were particularly interested in hypervigilance, always feeling that you need to monitor your environment for potential threats, says Cecilia Hinojosa, AG21, who was first author on the research paper in the Journal of Psychiatric Research and is now a postdoctoral researcher at Emory University, focusing on PTSD in women. Previous research has found that hypervigilance may lead people with PTSD to respond with fear to signals that are ambiguous or not clearly threatening. For example, hearing a firecracker might trigger fears of gunshots. The team, led by Tufts researchers, studied male identical twin pairs using fMRI studies of brain activation. By studying identical twins who share the same genes, the researchers could show which traits are familial and which are not. In a set of 12 identical twin pairs, one twin had experienced trauma and developed PTSD, while the other was not trauma exposed. A set of 15 identical twin pairs were used as a control group. One member of that twin set had experienced trauma but not developed PTSD, and the other was not exposed to trauma. While reactions of people with PTSD to trauma-related imagery have been studied, no one had previously examined their responses to ambiguous imagery while doing brain activation scans. The research team focused on two brain mechanisms of PTSD. The first was heightened activation of the amygdala, a part of the brain that is involved in processing fear-related stimuli, resulting in the fight, flight, or freeze response. Every time we experience something that could be potentially threatening in our environment, the amygdala starts a chain reaction of responses in the brain, says Hinojosa, who as a graduate student worked on the study with Lisa Shin, a Tufts professor of psychology and expert on PTSD. The second mechanism is activation of the medial frontal gyrus, a part of the prefrontal cortex involved in inhibiting the amygdala's response to things that are in fact not threatening. The study, which involved the researchers from Tufts, MGH, Duke, and the National Institutes of Health, sought to find out whether people have pre-existing brain activation patterns that make them more susceptible to PTSD, or if they acquire that activation pattern because they have PTSD. While the researchers were expecting the men who had PTSD to show greater activation of the amygdala when observing faces with surprised looks, they hadn't expected that the participants would have the same response to neutral facial expressions. Tellingly, the same was true in the participants' trauma-unexposed twins who didn't have PTSD. On the other hand, the group who had experienced trauma but not been diagnosed with PTSD did not show the same heightened amygdala response to either the surprised or neutral faces. These findings may mean that individuals who have greater amygdala activation before experiencing trauma may be more vulnerable to developing PTSD, Hinojosa notes. The findings may also imply that if a person shows pre-existing vulnerability to developing PTSD through heightened amygdala activation and experiences a traumatic event, we could potentially provide them with treatments as soon as they experience that trauma to hopefully prevent the development of PTSD symptoms, Hinojosa says. A final takeaway from the study is that the decreased reactivity in the medial frontal gyrus, which tamps down an excessive fear response, occurred only in the group with PTSD. This suggests that the lowered response in the prefrontal cortex is an acquired characteristic of PTSD, says Hinojosa, who earned a PhD in experimental psychology. She pointed to studies of non-human animals, which suggest that chronic stress or traumatic events are neurotoxic. Stress and trauma could be harming this region of the brain, so it doesn't work as well, she says. For next steps, Hinojosa says the study would need to be replicated with larger sample sizes and expand beyond the male-only subjects in the current study. About this PTSD research news, the author is Robin Smighton. Source, Tufts University. Contact Robin Smighton, Tufts University. The image I didn't reference an image earlier, but there's one here. I won't get into it. Just go to neurosciencenews.com. You'll find it. And it's in the public domain. The original research is under closed access and is from a paper entitled Exaggerated Amygdala Activation to Ambiguous Facial Expressions is a Familial Vulnerability Factor for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder by Cecilia Hinojosa and others, Journal of Psychiatric Research. In just a moment, I'll come back reading an abstract from that paper on neurosciencenews.com. You've been listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Alibokas Alexander on Spreaker, social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. Neuroscience News returns and continues with an abstract from that paper titled Exaggerated Amygdala Activation to Ambiguous Facial Expressions is a Familial Vulnerability Factor for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Objective. Previous research has reported hyperresponsivity in the amygdala and hyporesponsivity in ventral portions of the medial prefrontal cortex to threat-related stimuli in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Whether such findings generalize to be more ambiguous stimuli and whether such brain activation or abnormalities reflect familial vulnerabilities, trauma exposure, or acquired characteristics of PTSD remain unclear. In this study, we measured brain responses to emotionally ambiguous stimuli, i.e., surprised facial expressions, in identical twin pairs discordant for trauma exposure to elucidate the origin of brain activation abnormalities. Methods. Participants with PTSD, number equals 12, and their trauma-exposed identical twins, also 12, or co-twins, their identical co-twins, number is 12 also, as well as trauma-exposed participants without PTSD, the number is 15, and their trauma-unexposed identical co-twins, number also equals 15, passively viewed surprised and neutral facial expressions during functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and afterward, participants labeled and rated each facial expression on valence and arousal. Results. Amygdala activation to surprised and neutral facial expressions versus fixation was greater in the participants with PTSD and their trauma-unexposed identical co-twins without PTSD compared to the control twin pairs. In contrast, medial frontal gyrus MFG activation to surprised facial expressions versus fixation was diminished in the PTSD group relative to the other three groups. Conclusions. Amygdala hyperresponsivity to emotionally ambiguous facial expressions may be a familial vulnerability factor that increases the likelihood of developing PTSD after experiencing a traumatic event. In contrast, MFG hyporesponsivity may be an acquired characteristic of the disorder. Related posts are brain cell changes in Alzheimer's disease mapped, one that I just already read, New Clues to Sensory Brain Disorders, and antidepressants for chronic pain on the rise, but are they effective? You've been listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Alivokas Alexander on Spreaker, social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. This edition's reading focus has come to us from neurosciencenews.com. It was published on February 2nd, 2023, and is titled Shining a Light on the Biological Origins of PTSD. You can read this paper and others like it for yourself by visiting neurosciencenews.com. That's neurosciencenews.com. neurosciencenews.com, shining a light on the biological origins of PTSD.